Hey, Rashid. Hopefully, I'm saying your name right. It's always good to see a familiar face out there, familiar name at least. Daniel, all right. Cincinnati. Hope it's going well up there. It's been a while since I've been up there, but Atlanta. Hey, Jake, how's it going? Hey, David.
Doing good, doing good. Thank you.
Awesome.
I'm doing good as well.
Good to see you all. So, have a few people telling us where they're coming in from. We've got Flagstaff, Arizona. I don't know how far that is from you, Jake, and um, so far across the United States, looks like north of Boston. All right, so we probably have a pretty wide range of weather out there too, I'm guessing. I don't know.
I would imagine.
London, okay. I always
Yeah,
appreciate the willing to brave the time zone differences too. All right. Very cool. Italy, Ireland, Cambridge, Quebec City, Las Vegas, Ireland. All right, very cool. Um, is this anyone's first time at a Greenlight Guru event? Love to see if this is your first time. And I have lots of questions I could ask. I'm always interested in hearing what the audience has to say and bring to the table, but very cool. Glad there's a couple first timers. Um, at the end, we'll have a survey just to see what you think, and there should be an open field text box too. If you have specific webinars that you'd like to see in the future, feel free to put those in there. So stick around at the very end. We'll have that survey. But we're about a minute over, and it looks like we probably have a quorum, just letting it quite a few people in. So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar. The name has been slightly changed to Safely Designed, Integrating Human Factors into Risk Management, but it's still, we're going to cover the risk analysis and how it applies to medical device development. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm the moderator for today's session. So just a few housekeeping items before we dive into our presentation. First, we love to see you actively participating. So use that chat button, that chat tab on the right to connect with fellow attendees, to make your comments on the presentation. But remember to play nice. The Q&A tab at the top right next to that chat tab is that's where you can ask questions that we will specifically ask the presenters later and during the Q&A session at the very end. So even if you don't have a question, I recommend going ahead and checking that out and seeing what other questions have been asked, because you can upvote those questions. So if you upvote questions that are relevant to you, we'll make sure that we ask questions that are relevant to the audience. So feel free to check that out, even if you don't have a question that you want us to ask. Also, we will be sending out the full recording and the presentation slides to all registrants after this event. So watch your inbox for that follow-up email. At Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life through the work that we do in the medical device industry, which is likely a shared goal of many of you here today. We host these free webinars to share valuable insights, to learn from top industry experts, and to showcase our industry-leading solutions. So our software is designed to help medtech companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our software suite includes solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management. They're all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. So if you're interested in joining over 1,000 leading companies that trust Greenlight Guru, visit www.greenlight.guru for your personalized demo after today's webinar. Now to introduce our today's presenters. David Orenstein is a senior human factors engineer with 8 years of experience in the medical device industry and 4 years specializing in human factors. He leads use-related risk analysis plans and moderates user studies and consults on human factors issues for both medical devices and combination products. David has extensive experience conducting and reporting on formative and summative studies, including international testing in Europe. He holds a BA in psychology from the University at Buffalo and a BS in biomedical engineering from North Carolina University. Jake Duncan, PhD, is a seasoned human factors engineer with deep expertise in biomedical informatics and user-centered design for medical devices. He currently serves as the staff human factors engineer at Gelero, a Standard Group company. Jake brings over a decade of experience advancing usability, safety, and innovation in medtech. His background spans regulatory affairs, clinical user research, and academic instruction, including faculty roles at Arizona State University. Jake holds a PhD in biomedical informatics with published works on EHR navigation and perioperative care. He's passionate about optimizing human device interaction and shaping the future of healthcare technology. So feel free to fill in any gaps that I may have put, but other than that, welcome, and I'll hand it all over to you guys.
Thank you for the introduction, Edian. Hi, as you all know, I'm David Orenstein. I'm excited to be here, Senior Human Factors Engineer at Galero. The only thing I'll add is, in addition to doing a lot of the analytical work, I also do a lot of labeling work in graphic design at Galero as well. But let's stick to the topic for today, human factors and how that relates to risk management. So I'm going to jump to the next slide. Here's just an overview of what we're going to talk about today, Jake and I. So that's risk management and human factors, the topic we'll begin with. Then we'll move on to what is a URRA and why is it important. If any of you are unfamiliar with the term URRA, that stands for use-related risk analysis. Then we're going to talk about how it's structured, what are critical tasks. Jake will give some examples, and we'll go over some frequently asked questions, as well as take some questions from the audience when this is finished. Before I jump into all that, though, I'm just going to give a brief overview of Galero and Saner Group. Sorry. So for those not familiar with Galero, Galero is part of Saner Group, a global CDMO that works across the healthcare space. It includes their scope includes end-to-end engineering for pharma, medical device, diagnostics, you name it. They're in a lot of different spaces. Our capabilities include robust manufacturing, injection molding, everything from rapid prototyping to, of small clinical builds to large-scale, high-volume productions. Galero is Saner Group's U.S. division, which is currently based in Durham, North Carolina. However, Galero has facilities across the U.S., in Chicago and California, and manufacturing spaces in North Carolina and northern Mexico. The Saner Group includes about 850 employees working in research, development, and engineering, which includes human factors and human-centered design, which is what Jake and I represent. All right, so back to the topic at hand. So risk management and human factors. So what are these things? So risk management, as defined by 14971, is the systematic application of management policies, and procedures, and practices to the task of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risk. This is a very global definition, as it's meant to be, because it applies to multiple facets, of course, of combination products, medical devices, everything that's under its scope. So human factors engineering is certainly going to be a bit more niche in terms of its scope. And the exact definition of what it'll be will probably be somewhat dependent on the regulatory region that you're operating in. But if per the FDA, it's the application of knowledge about human behavior, abilities, limitations, and other characteristics of medical device users to the design of medical device user interfaces, systems, tasks, user documentation, user training to enhance and demonstrate safe and effective use. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but in short, what that's really saying is that human factors engineering is about taking a human-centered approach to medical devices and combination products and other healthcare products to demonstrate that they are safe and effective for use in the market, and if they're not, we're helping to figure out how can it be improved. So how does these things really relate to each other? How is human factors enhancing risk management? Well, there's four themes to think about when we're thinking about how do we effectively evaluate risk from the perspective of 14971. And those four things are: we're going to identify our hazards, we're going to estimate and evaluate risk, we're going to implement risk controls, and then we're going to verify those risk controls. So now when we apply our human factors lens and look at it through that, what that's going to become is we're going to identify the use errors that a user may perform that will lead to the hazards. We're going to analyze the severity of the harms which may ultimately result from those hazards. In some cases, we'll estimate the likelihood of these severities occurring. but often we don't end up doing that in human factors, and I'll circle back to that in a minute. So in terms of implementing risk controls, that's going to be pretty similar. We're going to determine what are the risk mitigations available to us, and we're going to assign them appropriately in our risk analysis. And then we're going to verify risk controls through testing, similar to how you would in any other facet of working in a medical device. Except our tests are going to be more formative studies, human factors validations, or otherwise known as a summative study. For those are usually the key terms that people seem to know, but if you're not solely familiar with them, formatives you can think of, they can be sort of like a pre-DV. They can also be more of just a fact-finding mission where you're going to present something to participants and kind of see where it goes. And of course, your summative, that's going to be the study, or your validation, that'll be the study you perform at the end after you've gone past design freeze and your product is representative of what would actually be manufactured on the market. And you're going to demonstrate that your risk controls are effective to prevent users from encountering serious harm or harm. So just circling back to when I mentioned talking about probability, as I'm sure most of you know, when you're doing like a DFEMA or a PFEMA, you're going to have your probability scores per 14971, P1 and P2, P1 being the likelihood that you run into a hazard, P2 being the likelihood that that hazard leads to harm. However, when you're looking at this through the human factors lens, we really just tend to throw that out the window. And the reason we do that is because the FDA and their guidance has just explicitly stated, because probability is very difficult to determine for use errors, the severity of the potential harm is more meaningful for determining the need to eliminate or designing out or reduce resulting harm. So I'm not saying that we wouldn't use it if that's what your quality system requires. Galero is well adept at working in multiple vendor clients quality systems, and we can always do a UFMEA, but that's just not really where the industry is headed per the FDA's guidance. What we might end up doing is, if it matters, is we'll include probability in a residual risk argument later. So another note, just talking about how human factors and risk management work together. One thing I really like to point out is when you're looking at things through the lens of human factors engineering, you're never looking at a single risk or use error or hazard in a vacuum. There's always going to be the full context of what happened on your mind. And by that I mean, who performed the use error, because we may have multiple users involved in a product. Where did they perform it? What was the use environment? Are there more than one use environment available? And does the use error matter more in one use environment versus another? Who is impacted by the use error? Does the use error affect the nurse assisting the surgeon, or is it going to jeopardize the patient's life? What portion of the user interface was the user interacting with when they did it? And so on. So as an HFE, human factors engineer, you're going to study not only what you can theorize, but what you can observe. And we observe these things when we do our formative studies, our validations, potentially going shadowing and getting into the real world, so we can really get familiar and intimate with representatives of our user group and the use environments they work in. So now let's talk a little bit more focus on the URRA itself. So I'll start by talking about, where does the URRA fall into this? So it's a little hard to see because of the grayed out, but you can see when looking at this slide that this is kind of a summary of the overall process that you're going to go through as you work from through feasibility to market release. And so the URRA, it kind of just spans across the whole spectrum. In the beginning, you're going to have your preliminary inputs based on what you know, and you're going to create a URRA. And then as you go, you're going to update and reiterate that URRA as you learn more, as different risk mitigations are made, until you kind of get to the point where your design is frozen and you're satisfied that the risk mitigations that have been put in place will be effective to prevent harm or serious harm, whatever you're trying to mitigate. So how do we get to the URRA? So before we get to the URRA, there's some important steps we got to do, and it really comes down to doing your research, doing your homework, understanding who is actually going to be your user, what are the intended uses, what are the indications for uses, what are the known use problems for similar products. So a lot of times before we get to the URRA, what we'll start out is by developing what's called a use specification. In that, we'll do a deep dive into who are the users that are going to be involved in the use of this device, and what are the environments they work in, and coming up with kind of a hierarchical list of all the tasks that they're going to be performing. So this is kind of what we're saying when we talk about defining use cases: the user, use environment, the context, the intended purpose of the device. And other things we'll do, which tends to fall outside of the use spec itself, is doing a deep dive into studying known use problems. So for those cases, we'll look into FDA databases such as the MAUDE database and potentially international databases as well. So we can kind of see what are the complaints out there that could be affecting these things that people are reporting on. And then after we kind of build up that information, kind of create that bottom level of where we're going to stand, is we're going to try and get into a detailed task analysis. The goal ultimately is to have a very robust task analysis, but in the beginning it may just be something that's more preliminary. So the point of the task analysis is to analyze the tasks that are going to be performed, but really it's more than that. It's really about setting the stage for what successful use means. So before we can really get into URRA and dive into how can everything go wrong, we need to have a firm understanding of how does everything go right. And so, and it's not always so straightforward because, when you're doing your design and you're into DFEMA, the designer, they have all their intents for what they put into this, and it's easy for them to state. But when you're looking at a task analysis and now you're considering your users involved, now we need to start understanding how does the user perform the task in the different environments they're in? Because it's not always so straightforward how the user is going to get something from storage, how they're going to set it up so that they can use it. Are there, depending on the context of the environment, there may be different obstacles that affect the way they set up their sterile field if one is needed. And so it's important that we figure out this list of success so that we can really dive into and get a really detailed list of how things can go wrong. And one of the things that both the FDA as well as other markets really push for is diving deeper in your task analysis and doing what's called a PCA model. So PCA stands for perception, cognition, action. And so what that means is, as we describe what the task is and the steps are performed, we're also going to think about what are the different visual, audible, or tactile cues that are available in the environment that the person is going to interact with as they are performing that task. And then cognitively, what are those cues going to cause that person to think about as they plan out the action? And maybe it's not so much conscious thought because things happen so quickly, but where are they going to take that person's mind? And then lastly, of course, is the action and how does the person perform the action? So, and we like to get into some details without getting too detailed, but it's good to have a pretty firm understanding of how they're doing it. As well, other things that you'll want to be considering when you're making the task analysis is just creating a list of, as you go through each step, who are the users involved and what is the start and end process that defines that step. So here's just an example before I turn it over to my colleague, Jake. So example of a PCA model, and this has kind of been simplified just for the purposes of this presentation. Let's take the task of selecting a medication vial. So the perception here is they see the labeling containing the medication name. So, but the perception can really go a lot deeper than that. You know, they open up the door, they see a bunch of different products in front of them. On those products, they're going to see individual labels with text. They're going to see colors. They're going to be looking at, so when you get to the cognition column, now they're going to be reading those different names to identify which is the one that matches what's on the drug order. Let's say this is a pharmacy technician pulling something out to prepare a drug order. They're going to be reading all these names as they're going through these different boxes to find the right one. But then when they find the right one, they're going to be looking at the colors on it, at the drug strengths, to make sure they pick out ultimately the right product and perform the action of selecting the medication. And so that's those are the different things that we're going to go through as we do our task. And by getting into those details, it'll help us form a really robust use-related risk analysis. So now I'll go ahead and turn the slide deck over to my colleague Jake and let him take it from here.
Thank you, David. So, as David had mentioned, we have built out, when we are looking at the theme, let's say drawing our medication into a syringe, we have built out a task analysis. The task analysis identifies each of the individual tasks and subtasks. But how do we carry that into the next step of understanding from task to potential use-related risks that occur? Well, that's where the URRA comes in, or the use-related risk analysis, which I'll refer to throughout the presentation as a URRA. So the goal of a URRA is to identify, and this is a key point, anything that is reasonably foreseeable misuse. So that is from the intent of the manufacturer. We don't want to go outside of the scope of reasonably foreseeable, using the device for something that is not entirely responsible or needed for. So the overall goals of a URRA are to break down the user tasks and identify critical tasks that would occur throughout use, which we'll discuss later. Identify the major use errors that can occur during use. The goal is to also analyze the hazard situations and harms that can occur to identify and throughout those use errors. And finally, to develop risk controls that can occur to potentially and aim to mitigate those risks as low as possible. So something to keep in mind is one of the other overarching goals of the URRA is to demonstrate to a notified body that you are submitting to, whoever that be, that we have systematically assessed the risk that can occur during use and aim to mitigate it as low as possible. It is an understanding that risk cannot be completely mitigated, but our aim is to show that it has been mitigated as low as possible. To the right, you can see just some general guidances throughout the different notified bodies that identify the usability process and identify different definitions such as critical tasks, use errors, as well as detail what should be included in your use-related risk analysis. So we have talked about a URRA. Let's talk about how you actually build this document out to analyze your different use errors, but also how to present this information in a structured, logical way. So as David mentioned, the first step would be a task analysis that you complete, and that is to really identify the individual tasks that take place. From there, we're going to present a model called the 3 O's, and that aim to identify use errors that would occur. Those use errors all have hazard situations, hazards, and harms associated with them. That is the identification of critical tasks based on information that we'll discuss. From there, you identify risk mitigations and then carry that information into different validation methods that you will use to show that you have aimed to mitigate your risk as low as possible. So let's talk about how we identify use errors. Use errors can be a slightly confusing and sometimes mysterious thing that we need to learn and focus on. So when we think about how a use error would occur, we have found that there are 3 main categories that help really identify and clarify those. The first being think about it as off base. So what happens if the user completes a task incorrectly? They don't do it as the manufacturer or the device UI intends you to. The second is omit. What happens if a user forgets to complete a task entirely? The third being order. What happens if the user completes a task out of sequence? So when we look at the subtasks and tasks in our task analysis, it helps to walk through each of these aspects and say, can a use error occur if we are off base, if we omit, or if there's an order issue? So next we'll go through and apply some of that information. So when we think about examples of the 3 O's, omit, off base, and out of order, let's just walk through some scenarios. So omit is typically something that occurs when you're leading to an incomplete process or a hazard. So an example of omittance can be poor usability or a confusing UI or general misunderstanding of an incorrect mental model that occurs when a user doesn't know they should complete a task or just is not reminded that a task should be completed. When we think of off base, again, this is something is done incorrectly. It can introduce misalignment between the user intent and the system response. So an example of that would be using an incorrect component at the use step. So a user is intending to complete a correct step, but they are off base and there's a misalignment in what they use or how the system responds correctly or incorrectly based on that. When we think of out of order, this is, again, if something happens out of sequence. So if an out of order use error occurs, it can create a potential new hazard by bypassing mitigations or potential workflow steps. So this would be an example. This would be administering a therapy before removing air bubbles from a syringe, where the steps are completed, but they are completed in a different order. Thus, we have a use error that can occur. So we have talked a lot about a lot of different words have been thrown around, use errors, omissions, hazards, harms, but it's important to also understand what are the different aspects to think about and how are they specifically situated within use-related risk analysis. So as part of use errors, in order to build out the overall scenario and explain what is happening, we have to have 3 major categories. We have to have a hazard situation, we have to have a hazard, and we have to have a harm. So the definitions can be seen here. As we can see, a hazard situation is a circumstance or generally setting the scene for how someone is exposed to a hazard. From there, a hazard is the source of harm that is generated. And then the harm is the injury or damage to the health of a person, damage to the property, or damage to an environment. So these 3, if you think of them as a chain sort of reaction, so to speak, they all build on top of each other. One thing that is important to clarify is that there needs to be, and you need to ensure that when you are building out your use errors and all the details, you need to ensure that a hazard situation is truly a situation. So one question that can be asked during that process of determination is, does my hazard situation create environments in which hazards are present? There's confusion in that a hazard situation does not lead to a harm. A hazard situation creates a scenario where a hazard can occur that leads to harm. So it's important to think about it as the situation is what occurs first, creates the hazard, causes the harm, not the other way around. So hazard situations, really the purpose of them is to situate and describe how someone is exposed to a hazard, not exposed to a harm. Hazards are then what expose the user to a specific harm. So it's important to know that your hazard situation is not meant to be a link between the hazard and harm. It is merely meant to set the scene for how a hazard can occur, which results in a harm. So one question you have to also ask yourself is it possible that my hazard situation could occur without harm? So a reasonable, decent example that we like to use is, let's think about you are hanging a ceiling fan up onto your roof of your house. So When we are hanging a ceiling fan, we are hanging a fan with just a single screw. That would be a hazardous situation that would generate a harm of an unsecured ceiling fan, and in some extreme cases, blunt force trauma that would result from the fan dropping on you. And it's important to distinguish that when we think about the hazardous situation in that scenario, hanging the ceiling fan with one screw, it cannot always generate harm in that it is not always, the fan is not always going to fall, but it can create a scenario where we have an unsecured fan that can then fall. So it's important to make the distinction that the hazard is not linked to the harm through the situation. It merely creates the scenario that can cause a hazard. So when we talk about the URRA itself, let's talk about now how is it structured. So we're going to build on that draw medication into a syringe aspect. So from that point, let's say that we have to think about that our hazard situation is what the user is, how the user is exposed to harm. The hazard is the source of the harm, and the harm is the injury or damage to the person, property, environment. So when we're looking at this task, let's say one of the examples of a use error that can occur is user drawing incorrect medication. In this example, the hazard situation that occur is that the label font is illegible. So that does not necessarily create direct harm, but it creates a scenario where the hazard of incorrect drug selection can be used and drawn into the syringe, thus causing the harm of allergic reaction. So it's important to understand that, like I said, these hazards, hazard situation, and harms, however the order of them is presented, it's just really the importance is the definition of how we present this information. So we have now established our general use errors, our hazard situations, our hazards, and our harms. We have to now take this a step further and determine when we go into testing with human factors, specifically, what tasks do we need to test? And in that case, we have a threshold that occurs when we test something that we're referring to as critical tasks. So a critical task is any task which, if performed incorrectly or not correctly at all, could lead to, and there are two different important distinctions that can occur here. When we're looking at specifically medical devices, there's a threshold of having a severity 3 or above that is defined as serious harm. When we're looking at combination products, it is a definition of having just harm, and there's an expanding there. It's not just the general classification of harm, but there's other aspects such as medical errors can occur, basically considering any level of harm or injury that can be compromised medical care. So it's important to think about what submission path you're going down with your specific medical device that you're working on, and ensure that you are following the correct definition of critical tasks. So when we talk about the different critical tasks, we have severity associated with them. So this is just an example of from 14971 that shows different terms and different severity levels that can be used throughout the URRA categorization. It's important to note that this is not an explicit list. You can have any definitions that you would like. Well, let me rephrase, any possible descriptions for your common terms of your severity levels. But when we get into this aspect of serious and above, there is a requirement that you have the actual aspect of serious relating to needing medical attention or intervention. But other than that, you can freely define these different severity levels to whatever is used within your organization. So we have critical tasks. Now, what do we do with these critical tasks? We understand that we have them, but how do we test them, determine if our medications are effective, etc. So when we think about it as human factors testing, there has to be any and all critical tasks that you determine must be tested at the very end in summative testing. So that is with the goal of users being able to perform a task unaided in their realistic use environment, and we score those tasks for successful use. So we determine what tasks are critical. When we go into summative testing, we allow the user to use the device, and we see whether they can use it successfully or not. If they have any kind of use errors that we observe, we root cause those errors, and then we score them and write justification for residual risk. One important note to make is that critical tasks should all have mitigations for risk. And one of the important aspects that I want to hit on is the focus should always be on interface design changes first and foremost. When we think about that, it is important that while we can implement labeling changes for potential mitigations, the most effective mitigation that can take place is through changing the direct design or the UI of the device, and then we can follow up with labeling changes. But it should not be trusted that first and foremost labeling changes can be an effective mitigator. They can be used in conjunction, but we really aim to try to make an interface change and then follow up with a labeling change if that is not possible. So an example of an overall how an overall built out URRA would look like, we're going to build on that drawing a medication. So let's say we're looking at injecting the subtask of injecting medication. So we have a use error of user does not push the needle deep enough into the intended area. And we're setting up the hazard that occurs with the hazard situation being that the needle pierces too shallowly. Now, a reminder, this is not necessarily going to generate a hazard, but in this scenario, the situation is that the user does not pierce the intended area deep enough. The hazard being critical performance, harm, patient discomfort, and a severity of 1. In this case, not being a critical task. But if we look at the second task of drawing a dose, the hazard being incorrect drug and a harm of allergic reaction with a severity of 3, that would push this into the critical task territory, thus causing it to need to be scored and observed in our summative testing. So we have all these critical tasks, we've tested them. When we go through our different critical tasks, really the goal is throughout formative testing as well as into summative testing, it is to reassess multiple times whether our mitigations are correct, whether they are effective, whether there need to be more in place or not. So think about it as when you have a critical task, formative testing confirms your design, your UIs, and your mitigations that they're effective. Summative testing essentially proves that they can be done effectively and that can be done safely. So the goal of overall testing is we aim to really show that risk is minimized as low as reasonably allowable. That is an important aspect of overall URRA testing. It is understood that no risk can ever be zero, but we are really aiming to mitigate it to as low as reasonably allowable for our users. So following any testing that we do, whether it be formative or summative, but especially summative, we want to verify that risk controls are really aimed to be user-centered. So by that, we really aim to modify the mitigations and the design UI to really work with who our user is, what their use environment is, whether it is effective for them or not. Then we can implement secondary aspects such as training that can be taken on, followed by any labeling, where really we want to focus on our user-centered and our user interactions, and then utilize any secondary aspects such as training. Another reminder is that URRAs are living documents, so they are updated after all of our different formative evaluations. So we can test a mitigation, implement a new mitigation, and retest it and modify the URRA as far as throughout the different formatives, however many you choose to complete. And then ultimately the summative is where we determine if our final locked-in design is effective at mitigating risk to as reasonably allowable. A couple of common pitfalls that we have experienced and seen throughout our time as completing URRAs is some things to keep in note. Use errors do not always equal harm. So just because a use error occurs does not mean that it can cause direct harm to the user or the patient. Another thing that we want to really keep in mind is that we are considering reasonably foreseeable misuse of devices. So that is something that we want to keep throughout when we go through the task analysis and the URRA, is that we're not going to identify use errors of someone using a syringe as a hammer to pound on a loose IV line. That is just not a reasonably foreseeable use of the device. Thus, we do not consider it as a reasonable use error. HF has the goal of really maintaining traceability of hazards, harms, and mitigations as part of the greater umbrella of risk management. So it is one of the tools, the URRA as well as the intention of HF is one of the tools of risk management that can really aim to keep traceability, but also make sure that we are maintaining a current running list of our hazards, harms, and mitigations. So, like I said, our first priority is really design mitigations when we're focusing on this. Our second priority should be labeling mitigations. We should not aim to just change a label and hope that that is an effective mitigation when there is a potential design mitigation that can really aim to improve the overall design. And another piece to keep in mind is URRAs are not just a checkbox for an HF. They really aim to contribute to device design, to risk mitigations, to the overall risk management process. They are really meant to be a tool that is used both for human factors as well as risk management to complete ultimately what the goal of every device is to make sure that it is safe and effective for its intention of use. So thank you, and we can open up to Q&A potentially now.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was great. We have a lot of questions, a lot of good discussion as well. So thank you all for doing that. So Michael asked, he says, did I hear you correctly? Does the FDA prefer URRA over a use FMEA? Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. The FDA prefers the URRA. So the UFMEA is still a valid tool to use. It just tends to work in probability as part of your scoring. And then typically when you're doing a FMEA style, you're going to combine your probability and severity scores, get an RPN, and then the RPN will generate when you what your thresholds are for acting upon risk. The FDA's preference is not to go with this route. As I quoted earlier from their guidance, they even have a guidance that speaks specifically to URRAs. Feel free to look that up. But their main focus is what is the severity that can result from harm, and they want us to act based on severity alone.
Okay. Makes sense. Okay, so Divya asked another question about, and maybe it's worth mentioning too, a little bit about the, I don't know if this question was explicitly stated, but about design changes versus design mitigations versus labeling mitigations. We have a lot of people quoting 14971, which is cool to see in the comments, but I guess you categorize the design or the design changes as inherent safety by design and protective measures, and then information for safety and training would be kind of another section. From an engineering standpoint, that makes sense to me. I don't know if you have any comment.
Yeah, so I guess the biggest thing is that when we are working on this and kind of working and observing these design changes as human factors engineers, we are really taking it from a user-centered design approach. And in order to implement the most effective change, we have to think about what is directly going to impact the user the strongest, that being a change to the physical design versus depending that a user is going to look at and see a label, no matter where that label is placed. If we can create quite literally a scenario where the device design does not allow you to complete a task or makes it much more difficult than just say a sticker or otherwise. That is why it is really a valuable tool to focus on the UI modification, then follow it with training. It's ensuring that training is enforced in your clinic. It's ensuring that the training is also given effectively, whether it be, an in-session or if it's handed down from user to user. So that's why really a design approach to those modifications is definitely something that is at least carries a little bit more power than a labeling design. In no way am I saying that it's effective one or the other, but that's how we view it from a user-centered standpoint.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay,
and I'll jump in there real quick just to add to that. And I've seen it where we've done validations where there wasn't an opportunity to do a design change, and we ended up having to work in a labeling change because something wasn't going right, and people just outright ignored the label. We put labels in multiple instances on the carton, on the pouch, and we tried to make them pretty bold in order to be attention grabbing, and people just pushed the IFU to the side. They made their own. They ignored the label, looked at the product, made their own assumptions about how it worked, and then they used it wrong. So labeling is a hard thing to rely on. Similar to what Jake was saying about training.
Yeah, we've seen scenarios where quite literally, like David said, a user will take an IFU out of a box just to get to the device, put the IFU back, and then go and assume they know how to use a device. So that's what we say when we can't depend on labeling the strongest compared to just a straight design change.
Yeah. I think if we were honest about our own interaction with a lot of products, I think that's the way most of us do things. So that makes total sense to me. Although I've noticed as I get older, I read a lot more IFUs. Okay. Divya asked, if you have a device which is classified as a non-significant risk device, would we still have critical tasks? Do you want to speak to this?
Sure. So I did a little research on it because I saw the question in the chat while Jake was talking. From what I gather, non-significant risk device is a term relating to clinical trials and the type of trial you're going to run. The examples I saw in there include Foley catheters, contact lenses. So you could still have critical tasks for these. So the thing to think about when we're assigning critical tasks, we're not so much thinking about, it's not so much like it's a class 1 device where it's a Band-Aid. Even a Band-Aid you technically could have critical tasks for if as you work through it. It all comes down to what is the threshold for severe harm, how you're defining it, and what you think a user could reasonably do wrong with it. I would assume with non-significant risk devices, you're probably going to see less critical tasks than more, but it's certainly possible. It all just comes down to doing the task analysis and then completing a URRA and seeing where you land.
Yeah. And there's also some advantage to having clinical input into your harms and severities at that point. So if we have, someone, a clinician that is a expert in the field says, well, that is not as severe of a harm as I'm concerned with, that is also something that can contribute into that aspect of critical tasks.
Okay. All right, great. Stephen asked, what is the level of depth of the task analysis? Should the task analysis in the URRA contain the subset of all tasks, only those directly related to the use of the medical device, or should it contain a complete list of all tasks, including tasks required before using the device and after using the device?
Yeah, so I can take that one, and David, jump in at any point. So when we consider the task analysis, we want to consider any steps that are required by the device for preparation, and then follow up. And what I mean by that is there's a more recent emergence that is allowing for us as analysts to identify what is part of clinical practice. So things like standard operating procedures that occur regardless of the device UI. So sanitizing a specific area of the skin or things like that can be outside of scope. But anytime that we have a user step that would influence when the user has to leverage the UI is when we start our task analysis. So we don't worry about if we are going through administering of a vaccine, we're not worried about the check-in process with a user because that has nothing to do with has no impact on how the device is going to be used. That's when we start our consideration is this going to affect how I use the device? And that clinical practice thought can be a powerful tool when saying, hey, this will be done regardless in the clinical practice of whether I'm using a syringe or a scalpel or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Okay. I really like this next. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say an example to add to that is if you're working on an ocular injector, there's going to be a lot of steps that may occur after you've already got your device and you place in your sterile field where you're prepping the eye for the injection. Personally, I like to include these steps listed in the task analysis, but I'll put in notes in there that make it clear that this is kind of outside the scope of what the product is. And the reason I like to do that is because it helps me demonstrate to the FDA that I've considered these steps and I'm demonstrating that they are outside the scope of the product's control. And so we will not need to develop risk mitigations for them.
Okay. That makes sense. All right. Thank you for that comprehensive answer. So this next question I really like from Sanjana, because we talk about a lot of different specifics about terminology, but I think this is a really good question. What kind of concrete data can we use to prove the severity of a risk or error so that it's not based on our judgment or assumption? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so again, I think this is where it really benefits to have a clinical team or other, expertise. Us creating these use errors and looking at it from a human-centered design standpoint, we can look at it from what risk does occur to the user. But yeah, we only have, previous devices or guidances that show what a severity can be. But when it comes to, an example of some different harms, if we're pushing around a heavy cart that is used for administration and you run over your foot and cause bruising, I don't have the clinical background to know how severe a cart is going to be. But if we think about it, a 5-pound cart may cause a stubbed toe versus a 350-pound cart could break a bone. So there is some kind of general knowledge that can go into those determination of severities. But it is also really important, like we said, these are all clinical settings usually, or home settings they're using a clinical device. So we have to have feedback and specific clinical knowledge that comes into determining how extreme those severities can be.
Okay. Good answer. Thank you. Trying to find maybe one to end on, because I know we're getting really close on time here. There were a couple of questions around SAMD and maybe even AI, but let's just maybe stop on this one. Angela asked, can you please comment on task analysis for SAMD? If there are many tools the user can use in the system, the list becomes quite extensive. Any thoughts there? Anything specific to software?
Yeah, I agree that the list can become quite extensive. Really, the best way to approach software as a medical device is to just think about what are the overall tasks that you're trying to perform, that you can perform within that software, and then break it down into, and then break that down and just take one task at a time. And what are the steps the person has to perform as they go from, point A to point B in the software to complete that task. And what steps might they have to perform outside the software while they're doing it. And you might just have you don't necessarily have to have separate task analysis, but you might just have separate worksheets for each different task that you're going to perform at a high level.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. Well, any other last thoughts or comments? I know there's lots of questions. Those of you, we didn't get to all your questions. I apologize for that. We will be passing those on to the speakers so that they'll be able to do whatever. If they're able to answer them, that's fine. But I know there's a lot of them. They may not be able to get to all of them. So just keep that in mind. But feel free. I'm sure they'd love it if you reached out to both Jake or David or anyone else at Galero. But yeah, any last thoughts you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I think it's just important to know that while use errors and working through a URRA and things like that are obviously science. There is some of an art to it. There is some of a personal, there's an aspect of design to it. What you think about whether driving different opinions of USARES. It's not just a strong, true, one path of this will occur, or will this will not occur. We have to think about it from different user standpoints, different use environments. I may think that a use error can occur, and David may have a different opinion about that. But it's important, and I think it's an interesting point of it's an art as much as a science, just like anything else.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll add, it's a daunting task, and for big projects, it can be a really big to-do. We're certainly always here to help if anybody wants to reach out and talk to Galero about how we can fit into your project. Working through it and navigating and understanding what the FDA might have expectations of, it's just something that really takes experience to develop.
Yeah. Okay. David, Jake, thank you so much for the informative presentation and all the valuable insights throughout today's session and in the Q&A. As a reminder to those listening, we'll be sending out today's recording and the slides later on, so keep an eye out for that email. And on behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all for attending today's webinar. I will go ahead and put that survey out, so if you can see that, love to hear your answers. Feel free to answer that if you're able to. But until next time, have a great rest of your day. We'll see you all next time. Take care.
All right, take care. Thanks, everyone.